All right, so I'm really glad that Ted just gave that talk, because I think I can skip half of our slides, which is that will make us have some chance of being in time. So we're about to talk about a very similar topic to what Ted just was talking about, except we're going to show you data that look exactly the opposite and then come to the same conclusion, which is that Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips were wrong, all wrong. So I hope you're ready. So I think I can skip the intro, which is really all about what do we really know when we see acceptability judgments that are negative or that are lower than something else. If you see a contrast in acceptability, what does that mean? Well, sometimes it looks like that, but if it looks like this, we don't really know. It's hard to build theories out of, is this really ungrammatical or not? So we want to know the answer to this question. And the question that we're really asking at the base of this is what factors are influencing acceptability judgments? There could be processing-related things, there could be grammar, there could be maybe some other things, and you want to know how those things combine to give you the judgments that you can actually observe, because you can't look inside the people's heads to see what their grammar looks like. And we know this is a problem because the default assumption that the acceptability judgments always reflect grammar is something that we, literally all of us, would pretty much believe to be false. Right? We know that it doesn't always reflect grammar because we have these sentences that most people judge to be pretty bad. We give them the star, but we don't think it's because of grammar. We think it's for some other reason. So this puts us in a pretty difficult position, right? So processing difficulty and grammatical violations can both influence acceptability. Then you have an acceptability contrast, but it could mean that both of your options are grammatical, but one is just easy and the other one is hard. It could mean one's grammatical and the other one's ungrammatical, or it could mean that they're both ungrammatical and one is easy and one is hard, right? And so in our various work between me and Philip and Ivan and some other people have found examples of all of these cases. So how can we tell the difference between these different contributing factors? And so we need some criteria for telling them apart, and as Ted has just told you, it's been proposed that individual differences in processing resources could help us with this, right? So maybe looking at how judgments correlate with these individual differences, how they're related to the individual differences, can be one answer to the question. So the task that we're going to talk about today is a reading span task, which is different from the one that Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips used, the two that they used, and it's also different from the one that Ted just told you about, so if you're getting confused, that's probably normal. This is one where people read sentences and they have to memorize the word at the end of the sentence, and then they keep reading more sentences and they have to keep remembering the words from the end of the other sentence. So you start out just doing 2 in a row, then you do 3 and 4 and 5, and if you're really mean, you make them do 6. We never make them do more than that. So the logic behind this, and this is the logic that Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips were using also, I think, is that if the people who have higher reading span scores or any other scores on any other measurement of working memory experience less difficulty with hard sentences because they have more resources, then if your acceptability decrement is really due to processing, these people who have less difficulty with it should give it a higher judgment. Right? Because they aren't having a hard time. So if it was due to having a hard time and they aren't having a hard time, they shouldn't show this decrement. And so a corollary of this, I guess, was something that you have to also believe to be true in order for this to be useful, is that if processing complexity isn't the reason why you get the decrement, like it's really grammar or something else, then you shouldn't find this positive relationship with working memory scores or whatever it is that you're using, right? So if it's just about grammar, then it should be wrong for everyone, not just for people who are good or bad at understanding the sentence. So we looked at this. This is I'm giving the part of the talk where we do the first part of what Ted did, which is, does this actually work with anything else? Forget islands. Let's look at other stuff. Things that we know are hard. Can you find any relationships between this task and the other stuff that we know is hard? So this is parallel to the first stuff that Ted showed you, right? So we're looking at sentences that have dependencies that are either short or long. So you have, either 2 short ones, a long one and a short one and a long one, or 2 long ones, right? So some of these sentences are easy and none of them are actually easy. Some of them are hard and some of them are really hard. And what you find is that especially in the cases where they're really hard, the acceptability judgments are in fact higher as reading spans scores increase. So we can come back and talk about this at the end, but one thing I want to suggest as a possible reason why we may have found this when other people didn't is that one of Philip's little-known superpowers is writing island sentences that don't suck. So his sentences are actually a lot better than most other island sentences that are used in other studies, and by better I mean they sound better to people. So that could be one of the reasons that this is different. So that's something we can come back to. But just going back to, so you do find a positive linear relationship between reading span scores and the difficult sentences. These are non-islands, right? Just regular old difficult sentences. And that's exactly what you predict according to the logic of Sprouse, Wagers, and Phillips, right? That things, if the judgments were low due to difficulty, then people with higher reading span scores should like them more, and they do. And just to be sure that this isn't true about all sentences, we looked at some things with grammatical violations too. So these sentences have either 1 or 2 grammatical violations, and you don't find the same relationship, right? So especially for the really bad sentences, if anything, you find the reverse, that people with higher reading span scores like them worse rather than better. So this is just showing that there's a negative relationship with reading span scores for the ungrammatical sentences. So Philip is going to come up now and tell you a little bit about how we have tried to apply this to islands to see if we can make some progress by using something to predict something rather than nothing.
Yeah, so as both Laura and Ted said, the logic here is basically the same, that we want to look at what happens in unambiguous cases and compare it to what happens to cases where we're not really sure what the best or the right analysis is. And so we're going to focus exclusively on the case of WH Island. So this is actually, I think, a case that you should find fairly acceptable as a WH Island. Adoption is something you should decide whether you can commit to before diving in. Right? So this is actually an attested example, and I have lots of other ones like these. I'm not going to really talk about what it is about these that make them so good, but we were able to make at least 24 that sounded reasonably well, and you'll see that in the results. So we're going to see how the judgments for these particular items relate to the reading span score, essentially. And the other critical part is we're going to compare how the same people relate with respect to their reading span scores for completely ungrammatical items, at least things that we would standardly attribute to being not processing difficulty, to take the most conservative position here. So we used a thermometer judgment task. Basically, we're getting acceptability judgments from people, and then we normalize them. And we had 40 participants in this with 24 sets of island items that I'll show you in a second, with basically 3 times as the amount of fillers. So the critical items look something like this, and the key one is the one up top here. It was time to admit which methods Cheney knew whether the CIA had used during the interrogation of terrorists. Cheney goes well with island violations, I find. These are the minimally different versions. So we have 2 manipulations here, right? One is whether the embedded clause contains or begins with a whether or that, thus making it an island or not an island. And then whether the relevant dependency enters into this embedded clause or not. So in the bottom 2 examples here, we have both, in this case, a whether clause and a that clause, but the dependency stays at the top, basically. So really what we want to know is, how do reading span scores relate to these judgments, in particular, this case here. And then we're going to contrast that with some grammatical errors in a second. So first of all, just looking at the z-scores here, which are just normalized acceptability ratings, what we see is that there's a main effect of embedding, that sentence judgments are lower when the dependency enters into an embedded clause, no surprise there, and the effect is worse when you have an island boundary there. And so this turns out to be an interaction of dependency length and islandhood. You notice also that the judgments here are also about 0 on the scale, which means basically that for all of these sentences, the judgments are either at or above the mean across all of the items in the experiment on average. Right? So now the key thing here is about how these judgments relate to the reading span scores for the individuals. And what I've plotted here is for each condition in the experiment, I've put a reading span score on the x-axis and the acceptability z-score on the y-axis. So what you basically see is that in all 4 conditions, more or less, except for the easiest one, this one according to the ratings, that there's an upward positive relationship, right? Actually, this turns out, according to the linear mixed effects modeling, should just be a main effect of reading span scores, that for these particular items, people with higher scores give higher judgments for basically all of these. The fact that there's slight variation here is not really important statistically speaking. The model doesn't think so anyway. Okay, so higher judgments are provided by those with higher reading span scores, and these effects are most pronounced in the case where you have the worst conditions according to the judgments, right? So this looks a lot like what Laura told you about at the outset of this talk with respect to completely non-contentious cases of processing difficulty, where when processing difficulty was high, you saw a positive linear relationship between judgments and reading span scores. But by itself, this merely shows a relationship between judgments and measures of memory of some sort. And what these reading span scores are actually measuring is not necessarily important for us here today. But what's important is that what I've just shown you here, if this was all we had, then this is technically reconcilable with some position that islands should be understood in terms of grammatical constraints. Because the effects of grammar can simply stack on top of whatever processing difficulties there are. That means that a grammatical theory of islands can say, yeah, sure, they're hard sentences to process, but they're also ungrammatical. So by itself, that reading span chart that I showed you doesn't show that there's no possible effect of grammar. So we have two empirical arguments, though, for why we don't think that's likely. So one is that in previous studies with Ivan, Laura and I have looked at these cases where you literally put together something that makes a sentence harder to process and something that makes it ungrammatical. So in this case, the key example is this one, and we can, as a comparison, use, this one. So the difference is whether you have a long or short dependency, right? So this underlying material interposes some material between a filler and a subcategorizing element. So they couldn't remember which lawyer that the reporter interviewed had defending, and now you have, in addition to this increased distance, when we compare it to this case here, so which lawyer is right next to had defended, you've also got an error here on top of this. So the question now is, if we now look at the reading span scores for individuals, in this case, does it look like the example that I just showed you from islands, that is, where there was a positive linear relationship? And the answer is no, that when there's a grammatical violation present, it doesn't matter if the sentence is hard or not. The linear relationship is negative, right? So this is the same set of subjects, minimally different items, but whenever we introduce this inflectional error, there's a strong negative linear relationship, and for the ones that are not bad, but both of them, as the example shows here, are fairly hard, complicated sentences, you get this positive linear relationship. So this plays out as an interaction in the linear mixed effects model. The second argument we have is that for the very same people who did the island effects experiment and who showed the positive linear relationship, we looked at examples where we had unambiguous grammatical errors as well. As the example Laura showed you, we had 0, 1, or 2 errors in the sentence. And here we find something completely opposite of what we found for the island examples, but consistent with what I just told you about, which is for the examples that have any errors in them, this one, and this one, the trend is negative, and it's basically flat for the case where there are no errors. So this is realized in the model as a significant negative linear effect of reading span score on acceptability judgments. Right, so in sum here, what's happening is that the judgments for sentences with grammatical errors tend to decrease with higher reading span scores as we've collected them. And this is replicated now in 3 different experiments, so this isn't just a fluke of looking at this one time and the particular subjects that we've selected. And the key point here is that if a grammatical error was really present in the island examples we had on top of the processing challenges, whatever they may be, we would expect to see a repetition of this pattern, that there is a negative linear relationship, or else they just cancel each other out. Maybe processing together with the grammatical constraints just flatten the line out, but in fact we saw a positive linear relationship for the key island case. So just to sum up here, what we've suggested is that sort of counter what Ted said, maybe we can see some patterns in the data that tell us about the relative roles of processing difficulty and judgment contrast by looking at individual differences. And in doing so, this should be of interest not only to psycholinguists or people interested in theories of individual differences, but also those interested in building grammatical theories and trying to situate those grammatical theories on a sound empirical basis. And that's where I'll stop. F. Yeah.
So I'm just trying to think, like, what the first analysis I would do in looking at those kinds of data. And what I would do is I would take individual scores for island versus no island communities, and I would try to relate that difference score to whatever measures I think are tapping into something relevant. Right? I'm just trying to understand what it means for working memory to be positively related with any sentence that doesn't contain some low-level error, which, I mean, wouldn't you want to, isn't the difference between islands versus no islands the relevant measure for individuals for the island?
Yeah, so on one hand, I have done this before. On the other hand, I think that doing this averaging over a whole bunch of results for the individuals may be actually obscuring some of the relevant effects, because an individual, so when you take these averages, you basically ignore the fact that the individual may be differing from point to point, and so by keeping, so in the graphs we've shown here, every single trial from every single individual who participated in the experiment is there in the linear relationships. So we do have the differences in differences score, just like Sprouse did. It's not yet significant. I probably won't run more participants with this. This is what the trend looks like. So it's at 0.14 for doing the differences in differences. I'm not convinced that what those differences and differences scores are actually telling me about the individuals there, and whether I'm losing a significant amount of statistical power in taking those averages.
But do you believe that for an individual you can get a reliable measure of how much they dislike islands? Do you think that's even possible? Because to the extent that that's possible, you should be able to get that measure compared to some control measure match for everything else except for islandness.
Because of the way that you rotate the items, you might need a really large number of items, because for each person, if we have 24 items, right, then they only get 6 of the items in each condition, and they're not the same. So you might need right. You might need. I mean, Philip will have to write 150 items.
But we did that, for your piece of my studies.
Yeah.
And it's doable. Yeah.
Yeah, that could help. I mean, with this amount of data, I don't think there's any hope, because the sentences are different within an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, imagine I was interested not in linguistics but in psychology. Why do you think there is a negative correlation between people's working memory span and grammatical judgment, which, if I understand correctly, means basically that if you're not very good at reading, you really are good at spotting ungrammaticality or something like that?
No, it's the opposite of that. That if you are very good, then you're good at spotting ungrammaticality.
Yeah.
Right?
So essentially, one explanation you could give here is that it could be related to the sort of participation effort thing, but the people who have the higher reading span scores more easily detect the errors, or they're more sensitive to the errors because of their experience of reading, or whether it's related to attention. Whatever the cognitive mechanism is there, they seem to be more alert to these errors.
Or hate them more.
And we're not sure from the data which is the appropriate analysis, because it doesn't address that question.
It might be good to actually get, it might be good to get them to see if they can find the errors, right? Is there something wrong with the sentence, and see if people who are higher working memory people actually find those errors, because then we can focus their attention.
So we have one case that speaks to this, which is that we sort of skipped past this a little bit, but for one type of error, here you see a slight positive relationship. That refers to a case where the verb visit here is missing the appropriate inflectional endings. And so we've found out by repeating this multiple times that it actually takes quite a bit of attention to notice what's going on here. So errors may well differ in terms of how they pattern. And I actually don't want to leave the impression that we think that all grammatical errors are homogeneous in terms of their effects and how they will pattern here. In fact, this may just be one big continuum of things that require more or less processing. At some point, the patterns shift because of the threshold being crossed.
Right, and I mean, we should probably say basically the same thing that Ted said at the end of his talk, which is that it really depends on what the sentences look like, whether you get this. Right, Philip has actually constructed sentences that were so hard that even the people with high reading spans just basically can't read them, and then you don't see this relationship anymore. If they're that hard, like they have to be in the sweet spot where, you know, it's not so easy that everyone can do it easily, and it's not so hard that no one can do it.
Okay, on that note,